Yes, welcome back. Um, Today we're with our very special guest, um, independent scientist Leuren Moret, who is a radiation expert, but also an expert in the HAARP chemtrails and electronic weapons systems area. Welcome, Leuren.
Thank you, Alfred.
Well, today we'll be covering a topic. I just checked online and Google, and there were 577 million articles online regarding Malaysia Airlines Flight 370. And I know that both of you and I have been in Kuala Lumpur. I myself have flown Malaysian Airlines and have met the president of that airline, or one of the former presidents, and a little bit about what's going on there. Today is Wednesday, March 12th, 2014, and Malaysian Airlines Flight 370, which was also marketed as China Southern Airlines Flight 748, from Kuala Lumpur to Beijing, China. On March 8th, 2014, the Malaysian Airlines Boeing 777-200ER operating the flight disappeared with 227 passengers of 15 nationalities and 12 crew on board, with its last contact with air control less than an hour after takeoff. And as of today, I went online and found one of these articles that said the 10 top conspiracy theories of what occurred to Flight 370. And I know that you and I have been corresponding back and forth on various aspects of this flight. And so in this exclusive program, we'll be looking at the how, by what means or by what weapons, the who did it, and the motive, the why, who, what, when, where, and why. And so I'd like to first, though, turn to a quote, very rich quote, I think, by a Canadian, Marshall McLuhan, a Canadian thinker, who said, I actually had the privilege of representing Marshall McLuhan in Hollywood, in Los Angeles, in the early 80s. The quote goes as follows, quote, World War III will be a guerrilla information war with no division between military and civilian participation, end of quote. From what we've discovered so far about what occurred around and to Flight 370 of Malaysian Airlines, how does that quote stack up?
It's very consistent with the developmental history of what I believe is the exotic weapon that was probably used on this plane. And I'd like to just read a quote by General Curtis LeMay, who was on the Joint Chiefs and was involved in the planning and execution of the John F. Kennedy assassination. He said, quote, there are no innocent civilians. It is their government, and you are fighting a people. You are not trying to fight an armed force anymore. So it doesn't bother me so much to be killing the so-called innocent bystanders. And he said that in 1989 in the book called The Rise of American Air Power, The Creation of Armageddon. We are in Armageddon now. And Curtis LeMay also started the RAND Corporation, which was the separation of the developmental stages and production of these weapons by civilian contractors separated from the Pentagon and military responsibility. So by passing on the development and responsibility and everything to civilian contractors, the U.S. government and the Pentagon were no longer responsible. They just had to hand out the money, and the civilian contractors created these things and did the media releases and the media promotion of these weapons. The civilians, the fate of civilians, the involvement, the victimization, and whatever, the destruction of the civilian base did not matter. It was irrelevant. In a book called Soldiers of Reason, the Rand Corporation and the Rise of the American Empire, that is the roots, that is the agenda of the Rand Corporation and the U.S. government in developing all kinds of exotic weapons. And the Rocketdyne facility in Los Angeles, in Santa Susana, was developing X-ray weapons for space. This was probably one of their products. It was probably an X-ray weapon which has no visible light that it releases. That facility at Santa Susana, as Curtis LeMay said, the civilian population is irrelevant. Even about his own countrymen. That facility illegally ran a research reactor for 10 years and poisoned all the groundwater with fresh fission products, which caused deaths and rare cancers in the children and babies and even adults in that area. And Dr. Chris Busby was their expert witness on radiation. He discovered these short half-life radioactive fission products in the groundwater, and they indicated that they were still illegally operating that reactor because the Nuclear Regulatory Commission had revoked their license to operate it 10 years before. Rocketdyne was informed of this discovery and quietly and immediately settled out of court with the 30 or 50 parents and children involved for $250 million. And Dr. Busby told me the reason that they settled out of court immediately is because they poisoned the entire city of Los Angeles. Everyone in Los Angeles was exposed to those experiments.
Now, taking that background and that weapons research and looking at the first of our questions, which is the how.
Mm-hmm.
The day before the March 8th disappearance of Flight 370, we have a top-tier press release from the U.S. Navy. We'll be putting this in the article that accompanies this interview, which if people go to the video description, in the video they'll be able to link to it, in which a new weapon system is discussed. And it says, Navy will deploy its first directed energy weapon to the fleet, laser weapon system. And it's a directed energy weapon that they call LAWS, L-A-W-S, in a misnomer of laws.
They always like those anniversaries and acronyms, and they're humorous, they think.
Yeah, so let's just look at this coincidence that the day before, on March 7th, the U.S. Navy announces laws, the Navy's laser weapons system, and it's the first directed energy weapon system in the Navy fleet. And on March 8th, we have, from what your preliminary research has indicated, the downing of an aircraft, and we'll go through all of that evidence that could very well have been downed by a law's weapons blast. And so this would almost be like a product demonstration. First, you take a press release and you release it on the 7th, and then on the 8th, poof, you demonstrate the product. Could you, because you've gone in this extensively and you have witness statements and you have all sorts of statements that cover, and you've looked at what the Vietnamese said and what the Chinese have said, and then what the Malaysians say and what the US say. So could you kind of walk us through that?
Sure. When the first news outlets reported that this plane was missing, almost immediately in the mainstream news, the Vietnamese were saying that that plane had been shot down by the U.S. Now, the Vietnamese are quite straightforward. They're ruthlessly honest, and they just say it the way it is, and they don't care whether people like it or not. They just tell the truth. And also, a Vietnamese Navy admiral released many press releases, and in the end, after the last 4 or 5 days, what he said has been verified to be true. Over time, the U.S. Covered up everything, and the Malaysians just kept moving the goalposts, saying this and that and contradicting themselves, and it was so obvious that the Malaysians were covering up and lying about it. So there we have the U.S. taking over all of the news outlets. The U.S. news outlets were dominating the media coverage by the third day after. Actually, it was yesterday. Today's Wednesday. Yesterday, and that would be March 10th. And they, the U.S. outlets hid all the evidence. They denied there was any evidence at all. And yet the Vietnamese had announced a day or two before that they had found the tail section and a cabin door floating in the ocean on the trajectory of the planned flight pattern. And then they also found 2 oil slicks that were 9 or 10 miles long, and they were a certain distance, which represented an amount of travel time from the time that the pieces started falling off and the time and location of the crash into the ocean. So everything was consistent with where that plane should have been, and the timing of the disaster, with predictable things that followed, the pieces flying off and the oil slick. By March 10th, which was Monday, the U.S. suddenly took over all of the media, and they were denying there was any evidence at all. The Malaysians started saying, oh, we need to look on the west side of Malaysia. It might be over there. The plane might have turned around back on its route. And there were all kinds of pieces of information that all contradicted each other. And the Chinese were really getting very frustrated, as well as the families of the passengers. So I began investigating, and what I discovered was that the New Zealand Herald reported that an oil rig worker claimed that he saw the missing Malaysian Airlines flight go down in the sea southeast of Vietnam. Quote, Mike McKay told his employers in an email made public overnight that he had observed the plane burning at high altitude. Now that is consistent with the plane reaching 34,000 feet, leveling off, and then they lost all communication with it. I quote, I believe I saw the Malaysian Airlines plane come down. The timing is right. I tried to contact the Malaysian and Vietnam officials several days ago, but I do not know if the message has been received. Mr. McKay said he was on the oil rig Sangha Merkur off southeast Vietnam. When he observed the plane, it appeared to be in one piece, he said. From when I first saw the burning plane until the flames went out, still at high altitude, was 10 to 15 seconds, he wrote. So that was a fast hit.
Right. Well, you see, she was still on thinking that it was all still going smoothly. Okay? And therefore, there's no connection. So now we're shutting down in order to have the connection to make, and then we'll make the cuts over on the other video tapes later. And I've also got on camera resyncing our video shoot. Yeah. So life is good so far. All right. So we'll go ahead and unless you have to call her. I think you have to. Okay, coming at
you. This confirms it.
Yeah, well, we know we're in an information war, ladies and gentlemen. And this is the way it will always go, and this is why we will always cover ourselves while we are covering the news that is being slipped past the public.
Right.
Hello?
Hi, Alfred.
Oh, wow. So you thought that you were on all the time?
Yes, I thought I was on the whole time.
Oh, they have really fooling us.
Yes.
Okay. If that happens again, I will call Larry on the phone immediately and say
yes.
we cut off.
Yes.
Absolutely.
So,
perfect.
How did you know we got cut off?
Because I got cut off from you.
You couldn't hear me. Okay.
No, the whole thing went down here.
Yeah. Okay.
And as soon as you said Vietnamese.
Yeah.
Here, I was totally disconnected from you. I tried to call in 6 times.
Oh.
Each time I went to call in, it said the person you're trying to reach is not available.
And that would be accurate because Leuren was online talking to you.
Yeah, so they set up a fake out.
Yes.
And so the way around the fake out is if I get cut off again, I'll call Larry on the phone.
Perfect.
Yes. Right.
Absolutely perfect.
So, so back up a little bit and prompt me, and then we'll start again.
Yeah. Okay, so here we go. 3, 2, 1. So, walk us through exactly what happened and how these tools were brought to bear from your research with the Vietnamese, with the Chinese, with the Malaysians, with the Americans. What happened to Flight 370?
Well, on March 10th, when the news was announced, Monday, March 10th, that this plane was missing, almost immediately, the Vietnamese announced that it might have been in the blogs, but it might have been in the mainstream media, but there was an echo immediately that the U.S. had shot the plane down. Um, in the first moments, in the first day after an event, you want to gather all of the information that you can before the cover-up starts. Not everybody is cognizant or seduced into participating in the cover-up. So the Vietnamese are known for being very honest. They're very straightforward, they're brutally honest, and they just put the information out there. And there was a lot of very good information coming from a Vietnamese admiral. Now, it is the militaries, no matter what country, who know what's going on in their airspace or incoming air traffic. They're tracking all of them. They're watching the planes that are not even in their territorial waters or airspace, because they want to see what's incoming and what's outgoing. So I knew immediately that the Vietnamese knew what had happened in real time. And over time, over the past 3 or 4 days, that has proven to be true. The Vietnamese have been consistently correct and honest about what happened. They found the first wreckage from the plane, the tail section and a cabin door, and I think there might have been a few other things. And they also found the 2 oil slicks. Now, the distance that the plane was from takeoff in Kuala Lumpur, the airtime, the distance it had traveled, and the placement or the discovery of the pieces from the plane as it fell apart, and the oil slicks that represent where it crashed into the ocean, are also consistent with the distance and the time of travel that it took to fall apart and then crash into the ocean, and from the time of takeoff from Malaysia. So I trusted that, and I trusted that first echo that came out that the U.S. had shot it down. We know that the U.S. in the past, the military has done demonstrations. They've shot planes down. Of course, it always gets covered up because they have control of the media. But they don't have control of the Chinese media, the Vietnamese media, the Malaysian media. They had more control of the Malaysian media, and even Thailand was involved. So by Tuesday morning, the media had been completely taken over by U.S. media sources, and it even started the day before when we didn't even have government representatives investigating the crash in the vicinity of Malaysia and Vietnam. So I knew that sort of confirmed that the U.S. had some kind of hidden or vested interest in controlling what was in the media. And as time went on, the media it was revealed in the media that the plane had taken off. They knew when it left the continental part of Malaysia and traveled over the ocean. They knew how long it had been in the air, and there were some irregularities, such as the mandatory check-in by the airplane at certain times after takeoff. The first one was missed, and they would have already been over the ocean by then. Other irregularities are that the air traffic controllers in Malaysia complained they had lost contact with the plane. They did know that it had reached 34,000 feet, and then within a minute they lost contact with it. That's what they did know and what they did admit. the Vietnamese admiral said that the air traffic controllers in Ho Chi Minh City were waiting for the plane and it was overdue. It never checked in with them, announcing that it was on the trajectory or clear to arriving over Ho Chi Minh City or near it. The Vietnamese air traffic controllers or the military, or probably both of them, contacted a pilot who stated to the media that he was flying a plane, I believe it was headed for Tokyo. He was over Vietnam. He was some distance, but not that far from where the Malaysian plane should have been. And the Vietnamese air traffic controllers asked him to try to contact the plane, which he did. And he said, I did not go through normal communications. I went through an emergency frequency that we have on planes and where we can talk to each other. He said, I did make contact with them, and the communication was very garbled. He said, I talked to either the pilot or the co-pilot, but I'm pretty sure it was the co-pilot, and I couldn't really hear him, and then it got cut off. Now, what I think is that as soon as they reached 34,000 feet, and they were still climbing, but they had reached their very close to their desired altitude, I believe that is when this disaster in the air occurred, because there was no more communication with them at all after that. And apparently today or yesterday in the media, they said, the air traffic controllers said, yes, it was all normal when we said good night. The pilot said good night.
Now, we'll go to some of the other things, but what is it that makes you think? What are the signatures that you've seen that make you think that it could be a directed energy weapon like the U.S. Navy's laws weapon that had been announced the day before the plane took off, or some other type of directed energy weapon?
Well, this is very interesting. There is a demo on the internet, which we will be putting in this video, that was released around the same time by the Navy, and it's a simulated demonstration first of this new laws or laser weapon system, and then they actually show a real demonstration live on a Navy ship, U.S. Navy ship, with a real drone which takes off from the ship. And in both of the simulated presentation and the actual demonstration, the tail section was hit by the laser weapon. Now, what was reported in the New Zealand Herald, these are the quotes from a letter by an oil rig worker who claims he saw the missing Malaysian airline flight go down in the sea southeast of Vietnam in the area where the plane should have been. The letter has been authenticated, and the paper says, quote, Mike McKay told his employers in an email made public overnight that he had observed the plane burning at high altitude. I believe I saw the Malaysian Airlines plane come down. The timing is right, he said. I tried to contact the Malaysian and Vietnam officials several days ago, but I do not know if the message has been received. Mr. McKay said he was on the oil rig Sangha Merkur off southeast Vietnam. When he observed the plane, it appeared to be in one piece, he said. That is consistent with laser weapons, and you will see that in the demo. From when I first saw the burning plane until the flames went out, still at high altitude, was 10 to 15 seconds, he wrote. Now, we do have a precedent for this, and that is the USS, was it the Columbus, the space shuttle that was hit by a directed energy beam. It was like lightning hitting it when it entered the airspace over California. And by the time it reached Texas, it had fallen apart and crashed. Same deal. They are not just doing it to civilian planes or military demonstrations. They actually did it to the space shuttle. So we have some we do have some precedents already for this. Other things that indicate that this was a laser weapon. Let's see. Well, first of all, the Navy announced on March 7th that they had this new weapon, and of course they always have to demonstrate it. They have to blow their horns and show off. But Lockheed Martin announced that in James that this weapon was now available for sale. So they were looking for a marketing event, a sales demo that they could put into the major media in real time. So these pieces fit together like kid gloves, in my opinion.
So what you're saying is that this is a human tragedy, but along with Marshall McLuhan's definition of World War III, where there are no clear lines between, it's an information war between, and with participation of civilians and military, the downing of Flight 370 could be a marketing exercise by Lockheed Martin and the Navy for this new weapon system.
It's a huge media event. It was the perfect demo. And I'd like to say also that the military globally and intelligence communities globally, especially intelligence communities globally, are all one unified cooperative organization. They're all knit together. They all know what's happening. They have to, for coordination and synchronization of these fake wars and false flags and so forth. This is an information war now. This is a media war. That's what World War III is. That's what the RAND Corporation is about. And Lockheed Martin and Rocketdyne, all of them, they're all working together. They make money making weapons, making war, and then making more weapons and more war. And what it's done the whole 20th century was a series of wars, each one more horrific than the last. These electromagnetic weapons, these laser weapons, this is Tesla technology. This is the new war now from space. It's just a new game with bigger toys for the big boys.
Let's just tie up a couple of loose ends before going to another area, and that is it's been reported today, March 12th, that China is releasing possible satellite images of a crash site. Have you been able to review those, and do you have any comment on those?
Yes, China released those a few days ago, but they didn't get picked up. They are now getting into the mainstream media, and they are pieces of large pieces of what looked like the aircraft floating in the ocean. They were not able to get to the floating pieces until the next day. I think it was too dark. So they were still floating the next day. And as soon as the Vietnamese announced that, there was a huge media campaign coming out of the U.S., which was all over the mainstream media, by Monday, March 10th, and almost all of the news coverage and the news stories were from CNN, Fox, ABC, NBC. It was all U.S. news outlets, and they denied there was any evidence at all. There were no oil slicks. The oil was tested. It wasn't from that airplane. The pieces of stuff floating in the ocean, it wasn't from that airplane. Yet it was in exactly the place where that plane must have crashed. So we see a whole turnaround, a complete reversal, and the disinformation and inconsistent statements from Malaysia escalated and turned on that day into just red herrings, such as we're searching the west side of Malaysia now. We're searching north of Malaysia now in the ocean. And so they were looking everywhere where they couldn't find any evidence of the crash, and they were denying that the pieces that obviously were from the aircraft and the oil slicks, they refused to even acknowledge that they existed. They denied it.
So the Malaysian military that was supposedly in charge of this search, was really cooperating with the disinformation campaign of the U.S.
Yes.
That shot down
yes.
the craft.
And that's consistent with your and my experience in Malaysia as expert witnesses, and you were a judge on the Kuala Lumpur War Crimes Tribunal for Iraq.
Right. Now, let's go to motive. And there's a very suspicious circumstance. And of course, this comes right in the middle of, we have first the Sochi Olympics, and then we have the upheavals in Kiev, and then we have the reaction taking place in the Crimean Peninsula, and a lot of complications there vis-a-vis Russia, vis-a-vis Crimea, which has been Russian and had been handed over by Khrushchev in 1964, and all of that. And just prior to the March 7th announcement by the U.S. Navy that it had this Law's laser weapon, which then apparently was tested openly in a marketing exercise on March 8th, Russia had a test, did it not, of the Topol system. Could you explain why that test was done, what the Topol system is, and what the strategic significance of that test was?
The Topol missile was designed and manufactured by the Soviet Union. It's also called the Sunburn missile. It's the most lethal missile in the world, and there is no defense against it. It has a 7-kiloton nuclear warhead. It travels at Mach 3. It was Mach 2 when it was designed. They've upgraded it. It now travels at Mach 3, 10 feet off the ground. And the Chinese and the Russians have made sure that all the enemies of the U.S., all the countries that the U.S. considered to be their enemy, Vietnam, I'm not sure if Venezuela has it, but many of the countries in the Middle East have it, and they are all pointed at Tel Aviv. Tel Aviv will be wiped out in 5 minutes with no opportunity to respond, to any incoming topo missile. All of the navies in the world, many of them participated in an exercise off of Taiwan about 2 or 3 years ago. And the Chinese took a ship out into the ocean to do a demonstration for the visiting navies from different countries who were observing this demonstration. And they painted a big target on the side of the ship, and they shot it with a topo missile. It sunk almost immediately, and that was the message and the demonstration to other navies. That missile made the entire surface navy obsolete for all countries. There's no defense against it. Now, laser weapons, these exotic laws or laser weapon systems that have been developed, and X-ray lasers were developed for space. Now that happened in space, that happened up in airspace, didn't it? If that is what was used on the plane, and it's very likely that it was. These weapons now make the topo obsolete. Is that what this demonstration is about? Well, not really, because the distance that these laser beams can travel is limited. So I asked a former Navy personnel who was familiar with the electronic weapons. He was in the Navy when they were developing them. And he said the distance that power pulse has to travel and maintain the energy in the beam enough to do the to kill a ship or a plane or whatever rapidly decreases with distance. And he said with what he knows about these, that pulsed weapon, energy weapon, if it was used on the plane, had to be within 10 miles of the ship that transmitted that beam. So they have to be within the vicinity. The energy is not great enough yet. These are demonstrations. They're not what the ultimate product is going to be, or the ultimate weapon is going to be. Now, what's interesting is this civil war or civilian war or whatever, this incident that's happening in the Ukraine and it's spread into Crimea, of course, is a great concern of Russia, and it should be. The problem in the Ukraine has been American interference. Hillary Clinton went over there, George Soros went over there. George Soros funded these colored revolutions throughout Central Asia in the former oil-rich republics in Egypt, and he also funded the equivalent of those City of London revolutions, the Occupy movement in Canada and the United States. So there's a lot of meddling in on the edges, on the margins of Russia by the U.S., and it's creating tension between Russia and the United States. And after this army interference and shooting civilians and shooting soldiers over there started happening in the Ukraine and the Crimea, suddenly last week the Russians demonstrated the Topo missile. And a few days after the Russian demonstration of the Topo missile, that plane went down with what was likely U.S. Navy energy weapons or laws.
So basically what we had as we understand it, is that in Kiev, when we had the great conflagration at Maidan Square, where almost 100 people were killed, it's now come out in a leaked phone call between the Estonian foreign minister and the EU foreign minister that there was a third force that had put snipers in there with orders to fire both on the police and on the demonstrators, thereby creating a kind of an incident, creating a war incident.
And what I saw in the media last night, is that Buckingham Palace made the order to shoot the police and soldiers in the Ukraine. So
Yes.
This takes it to London. Let's talk about the ties to London. First of all, Thailand is a British money laundering depot for the opium and heroin trade in Central Asia, including Afghanistan. Many of the bankers in Thailand are Chinese. They are involved in the opium trade. This is the legacy of the East India Company and the Dutch East India Company, involved in trafficking in opium illegally with China in the 1700s. That continued until about the 1900s, when the Chinese were able to get the British out of China. And of course, they had to wait for the 250 million Chinese addicted to opium to die off. So opium production from 1900 until the Vietnam War slowly declined almost to nothing. That is a huge amount of revenue, and the Dutch East India Company is also an extremely large player in this global economy, hidden economy. And that money, actually, from what I call Dope Incorporated, is 5 times bigger than the legitimate currency in circulation and the global economy as we know it. 52% of the offshore banks that are mostly on former island colonies of the British Empire, 52% of the banks are owned by Queen Elizabeth. Everywhere you go where there is genocide, pedophilia, drugs, crooked politicians, it's all coming out of Buckingham Palace. Now, in the Victorian period, it was a common saying, well, the sun never sets on the British Empire. Who would ever trust an Englishman in the dark? That's the reason. And we could say, and some English women, because these uranium pimps, these mass murderers that are running this global empire of drugs and crime are coming out of London. London is the world capital of terrorism. Follow the money.
Right, exactly. And so we'll follow the fingerprint of London in Flight 370. But first, let's get to the various layers of motives, the why.
Mm-hmm.
And the first layer is that following the incidents in Maidan Square in Kiev, where there was a Buckingham Palace-based order, and I agree with you that there's a solid evidentiary base for that, with a black ops sniper teams to fire on both the police and the demonstrators to create an incident.
And this huge media frenzy over the missing plane to take the headlines away from what's going on in the Ukraine and the Crimea.
Yeah, sure. Now, following that, then, Putin and Russia do the test of the Topol.
Yes.
So now the U.S., the Navy, comes back with a product demonstration
Yes.
and a public test of LAWS, the Laser Weapons System, which comes on March 7th and 8th with the mega press release,
Yes.
then the downing of Flight 370
Yes.
by the U.S. Navy, which is an answer to Russia and the Topol. Says, oh, you have
Yes.
the Topol? Well, we have LAWS. So that's one level.
Yes.
Motive.
But
That's
let's
yeah.
look behind that. Go ahead and finish, and then I'll discuss.
No, please,
Oh.
because I'm going to change to another level
Okay.
of motives. So if you'd like to go deeper into this motive. Go
Well,
ahead.
let's just look at what is really involved. The Topol missile has a range of 2,000 or 3,000 miles. The LAWS that was demonstrated in this video that was released by the U.S. Navy around the same time that Lockheed Martin announced their new product. That weapon system, these pulsed weapon systems, because of the attenuation over distance, in other words, the large amount of energy lost, that can only be used if the Navy is on the surface of the water and the target is on the surface of the water. It only has a range of 15 miles because these are line of sight energy beams. And the over the horizon effect means that the target is out of sight. It's over the horizon and not available to be targeted after 15 miles from the Navy ship that it's sitting on, the weapon system is on. With a target in the air, you have to mathematically calculate, and we did that before this interview, what is the scientific limitations, what are the constraints on how far an object can be from the Navy ship how far can that object be in the air, a plane for instance. And that would be about 10 miles. So there had to be a Navy ship sitting right under that airplane to take it down. So that is that's a piece of evidence that can be followed and investigated. And of course, Vietnam and the militaries around that region already know exactly what did it, where it was located, how they did it, when they did it, and when the plane crashed. But the Topol is a much more lethal weapon with a much longer range than what the U.S. is demonstrating as a prototype. It's a paper tiger right now. However, over time, that will be developed into a much more lethal weapon, and I think it will probably be up in space as well. I know they plan to put them in space.
Right, and we should mention that there is mention in, like, theorists are going into various hypotheses that there are other hypotheses about weapons that may have been used, ranging from HARP to a new thing called a dreadnought in the sky. I don't know whether that's a real weapon or not, but from the signatures, it seems to be a directed energy weapon.
It does, and when you watch the simulated demonstration and then the actual demonstration on board the Navy ship, it really does. The profile of what was demonstrated live fits the it fits the description of what we see in the video and the description of observations by people, for instance, the oil rig worker and the Navy admiral about what happened. So there is evidence that from observation that that is a possible and likely scenario.
Right. Now, let's go to some of the other levels of motive, possible motive. You had mentioned, quote, that there were personnel, people on Flight 370 that related to, quote, a car that runs on air. Could you talk more about that?
I investigated that, and what I discovered is that the 20 workers for a chip company, an electronic chip company based in Austin, Texas. 20 people were on board that plane, and they were the engineers and the quality control officers who examine the chips and test them before they announce that they're ready to be baked in the production line. And they're highly skilled, they're very well trained. Half of them were Chinese and half of them were Malaysian, because the chip company has facilities where they manufacture them in China and in Malaysia. And those chips are used in electric cars, as well as computers and controlling systems and industry, and so forth and so on. So when that plane went down, with those 20 highly skilled workers, that has a really big impact on production and on manufacturing for that producer. So that would impact that company and possibly benefit competitors. So that's one aspect. There was also an IBM executive on board. I don't know what he was involved in, but he was working out of Beijing, I think. But I think he'd worked in Malaysia also and had moved on to Beijing. So there is all kinds of very strange things and unexplained suicides and deaths and murders, especially in Singapore, related to the British intelligence and U.S. intelligence in that Southeast Asian region. And this has to do with taking down the Western economies, which basically the Fukushima disaster has destroyed Japan, North America, and Europe. Over time, that whole region will slowly fall apart, like Russia did after Chernobyl. And the life expectancy in Russia, because of Chernobyl, has decreased every year. That Fukushima disaster is thousands or possibly millions of Chernobyls. It has poisoned the entire Pacific Ocean, and that poison is carried into the Atlantic circulation. So basically, they've poisoned all the oceans of the world. That ends up poisoning the air column. And what is happening now is that planes flying for Alaska Airlines, for Japanese airlines, and even Southeast Asian airlines are suffering from metal fatigue. It's called the Wigner effect, from neutrons and radioactive particles and waves, or waves, impacting the metal and causing it to crystallize, which weakens it. And a few weeks ago, I found a video clip of workers at the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant, which is now a permanent point source of huge amounts of radiation that will poison the whole world. There's no way to turn it off. And the workers were standing outside. There were about six of them. A crane was operating, and they were removing spent fuel rods from reactor number 4, that building. It's very, very dangerous, and it will increase the radiation exposure globally by many times more than the Fukushima explosion to begin with. And these workers were moving the fuel rods out of the building, which is a disaster, into casks where they will be put in dry storage. And I was watching the video clip. There were 5 huge cranes in the background outside between the reactor buildings, and one of them just in slow motion collapsed right before my eyes, and not a single worker even noticed. What if that crane that they were using to remove the fuel rods had collapsed instead of the one that was parked?
Yeah, well, when we first heard about that Flight 370 was missing, the Wigner effect was one of the first causes. How did you discount the Wigner effect?
Well, I thought it was possible that that could have been the cause of the disappearance of the plane. That a wing could have fallen off, or usually it's the hydraulics and the landing gear, the areas where metal is crimped onto fittings. That seems to be where they're failing. But in the last few weeks, 3 fighter jets in Okinawa landing at the Kadena base, and you and I have stood there at Kadena base and watched CIA executive jets unmarked taking off and landing from that base. It's right in the middle of Okinawa. Anyway, 3 fighter jets lost their windshields while they were flying, and the pilots had to land the planes without a windshield. They're in pressurized suits, so they're somewhat, protected. They were able to land safely, but other things can happen where the pilot would not have time to eject or be able to land the plane. So then on Monday, it was in the news that a JAL, Japanese airline, was flying from Japan to the west coast of North America, and it had to make an emergency landing in Honolulu because of loss of oil in the oil pressure in one of the engines. And what we're going to see is the infrastructure of the whole planet slowly fall apart because of metal fatigue. And of course, this is all planned by the City of London financiers because they're changing the whole planet. It's called transhumanism. They will be building a whole new infrastructure that gives them control of everything.
Right. So, there's a whole separate program that we could do on that.
Yes.
On how chemtrails and HAARP have been used to implant and chip practically the entire human population.
So now that we know that the British are involved, there are a few other telltale signs or fingerprints. The passports, 2 of the passports that were carried onto the plane when it left, or they got through customs with these passports, they managed to get onto the planes, 2 Iranians. They were stolen from European tourists in Thailand, on an island that is a favorite resort area for Europeans and other visitors to Thailand, a year and 2 years before this incident. The air traffic, the airports are much more strictly controlled in terms of intelligence and surveillance and so forth in Thailand. And also the police are extremely corrupt there. But it's more difficult to get onto a plane with false passports in Thailand than it is in Malaysia. And so they flew with their Iranian passports from Thailand to Malaysia, and then they switched passports to the fraudulent, the stolen passports, and managed to get on the plane. And my experience in the Malaysian airport, Kuala Lumpur, is that they're very lax there. So Thailand is British controlled or influenced. Malaysia is a former British colony. It's very corrupt. And Vietnam has had a different history and experience. And they are, just by nature, they're more direct and more honest. And they'll probably get wrecked too, but I don't think they'll ever let the Americans back into Vietnam. They're fed up with the warships landing in their ports by now. So now another thing that happened is on February 28th, one of the only, I think she was the only female CEO of a Bitcoin company. This is an alternative currency that can be transferred around the world to different accounts without any fees. It's an alternative economy or currency. And this young woman, 28 years old, named Autumn Radke, started out in London working for Sir Richard Branson, who started Virgin Airlines, and of course he has a whole network of businesses now. So he hired her when she was 22, and he moved her around different companies that he owned until she was hired by, and he could have been involved in this Bitcoin company too. She was hired by a company a year ago in Singapore. She relocated to Singapore, and 4 months ago, she knew she was in trouble. The company was not doing very well. The sales she had expected to make, the business she expected to build in Southeast Asia did not happen. Of course, Bitcoin was being attacked under the covers by the London financiers. And on February 28th, she was found dead on the ground outside of her apartment building. Now that day, February 28th, is the day that I believe it was Thailand and Vietnam announced that Bitcoin was illegal in those countries and warned their citizens not to invest in them. So that must have been two of her big targets for marketing and so forth. But it was also the turning point, her death, for the beginning of the fall of Bitcoin. And we will see a cascade over time where company after company and the confidence of the public, because this is all based on trust and confidence in the viability of this alternative economy. I think it killed Bitcoin. I believe that's what it did, and that would directly benefit the international financiers.
Right. Now, let's trace again, going back to the motives. So far, we found two motives, for two layers of motives for Flight 370. The first, that it was the U.S. armed response to the topo by using and marketing an armed response, a black ops false flag operation, using possibly the LAWS laser. All the profile seems to be that way. LAWS was announced March 7th. Flight took off on March 8th, the day after. And you have the fight between the Chinese and the Vietnamese information and the American and the Malaysian information, clearly operating around a false flag. The second was that there were 20 employees of a major chip manufacturer who were on their way to China, but that would disrupt U.S. operations, right? Or
It would
Chinese.
disrupt the operations of one company.
One company. Now, let's get to a third area of possible motive, and this is something that occurred to me, and I know that I spoke to you prior to the broadcast because I really wanted to get a reality check on whether or not this is an area, and so we'll just put it out on the table and see what your response is. And that is that in 2007, I actually met the president of Malaysia Airlines, the then president, and sat with him and sat with the former Prime Minister of Malaysia, Tun Dr. Mahathir bin Mohamad, at a luncheon in Kuala Lumpur. The purpose of that luncheon was for sponsorship around the Kuala Lumpur War Crimes Tribunal, of which I'd been newly appointed as a judge. Of course, Malaysia Airlines, and along with a large part of the corporate structure, virtually all of the foreign embassies, with the exception of the United States, and I witnessed this because I attended the fundraising dinner, were patrons and supporters of the Kuala Lumpur War Crimes Tribunal, which was led by Tun Mahathir. So the Prime Minister of Malaysia was there, and he contributed $1 million to the tribunal. Now, so there was a very large both political network and corporate network behind the work of the tribunal. And what the tribunal actually did was that, number one, it found Tony Blair, the UK government, George W. Bush and his cabinet, Cheney and Rumsfeld and all their cabinet, guilty of the Nuremberg-level war crimes for the illegal war in Iraq and for torture in Iraq. And then in 2013, it found Israel. It was the first time in recorded history that Israel had been adjudged a war criminal for war crimes for its ethnic cleansing of Palestine starting in 1948, where 1.5 million Palestinians were ethnically cleansed and either murdered, genocided, or they had to leave the country. So this was for genocide. And these facts were placed on the public record for the first time in history. So I then speculated that an additional motive was that the parties behind, the ones who really pull the strings behind the U.S. Navy, that is, who runs Washington? Well, it's the City of London. We all know that the U.S. president is an employee of the Queen, and you just have to go back and look at the Bushes and look at Clinton, and they're all in the bloodline of of the Queen, and they basically worked for the UK monarchy, even though in name the US had a revolution. And that the motive was City of London bankers and Israel payback for Tun Dr. Mahathir's and his political and corporate network finding of Israel as a major war criminal in Palestine starting in 1948, and that finding was in 2013. And of course, for finding the Bushes and the US war in Iraq. We also found that torture in Afghanistan and torture in Guantanamo as war crimes. So that this was a way to like come in and completely, demolish Malaysian Airlines. The president, I looked at the board of Malaysian Airlines. They're like, they and that Dr. Mahathir's had really roped in the entire political and corporate structure, and now the U.S. Navy comes and just shoots down its plane as payback for what the tribunal did. And I wanted to ask you whether you thought that this was a credible hypothesis, or was it just some kind of loose conspiracy theory?
You're spot on, Alfred, and let me explain why. MI6 runs the intelligence network around the world. Queen Elizabeth is their gangster in tiaras. And her call from Buckingham Palace ordering soldiers to shoot other soldiers, or the infiltrators to shoot soldiers and police and so forth, civilians in the Ukraine, makes her their plumber, because the Ukraine situation is about plumbing for pipelines. And they have pipelines in different parts of the Middle East and Central Asia. Tony Blair is now their salesman to sell oil contracts for the Iraq oil fields, which the U.S. now has over 1 million medically disabled soldiers from serving in Iraq and being poisoned with the Queen's uranium. She has a $17 trillion stake in the global uranium stocks and that whole industry. This whole incident, the Malaysia incident, all of it is related to the plumbing, putting in the pipelines in the Ukraine, and that's in competition with Putin. He doesn't want the British interfering in the Ukraine and using the U.S. military to do their dirty work. Now, Tun Dr. Mahathir came from a village in Malaysia. He is Malay, he is Hindu or Indian, and he is Chinese. He truly, his bloodline represents everyone in Malaysia. He fought off the British he was part of the independence movement. He went into politics, he won a seat in parliament, and eventually he became prime minister, the first non-royal prime minister in Malaysian history. And for 22 years, he developed Malaysia for the people. He wanted to give them a better quality of life. He wanted to develop a nice infrastructure for them, and he did a fabulous job. The people have a much higher standard of living, and he's a very, very tough guy. He has a lovely family, and you and I certainly we're very privileged to meet them and to spend the time that we did in Malaysia, because he's one of the best leaders in the world, and he certainly was at the top of the Muslim or Islamic leaders in the world. So when George Soros attacked the economies in Southeast Asia, he also attacked and tried to loot the Malaysian economy. Mahathir fought him off fiercely, and he was one of the only leaders in Southeast Asia who was able to prevent his economy from being completely looted. Indonesia was wiped out. Probably corruption and infiltration by the UN and the CIA was the downfall of the Indonesian economy. But Mahathir he had enough political power and integrity to keep his country together. He also developed the whole oil industry. The Indonesian oil company was his creation. And I've been in the tallest building.
Sorry, you mean the Malaysian oil company?
Yes, Tun Dr. Mahathir developed and built that economy on the revenue that he got, or that Malaysia got, from the oil company he created for Malaysia. It's a national oil company. It doesn't belong to him. It belongs to the people. And because of that, the London financiers never forget and they never forgive. And he has been a target of their malice and unprecedented venality ever since that happened. He won, but they make you pay for the rest of your life. So anything that happens that damages him, that diminishes his legacy, that discredits him, you could just look to London and be sure that's where it came from.
Right. We're coming to the end of this segment, but I'm thinking, are there any overall observations that you'd like to share with our audience about this event, Flight 370? It looks like it's a U.S. Navy operation as part of the beginnings of World War III in the context of Marshal McLuhan. Are there any lessons that we should learn about this as we move forward through 2014, 2015, these years? People have talked about the tetra eclipses, that the 100th anniversary of World War I, all of that. What are your thoughts in these areas?
Well, the United States and the University of California in particular, where the Manhattan Project started in World War II to create nuclear bombs, this war industry involves corporations and the military and governments, but it's really the weapons of mass destruction that are produced in the universities and produced in the nuclear weapons labs and so forth, produced in the civilian corporations like Lockheed Martin and Rocketdyne. Those are civilian operations. And the government agencies like the Department of Energy, it's 95% contractors. It's a way to pump money into the private sector. And this whole movement of transhumanism and what is happening globally now, where civilians are they're just part of the wallpaper on the battlefield and off the battlefield, is something that is going to get more and more severe. It is the financiers who make the money. They make the decisions, and the royal families who own most of the energy companies and the gas and oil companies, they work for the City of London financiers. The financiers put the royal families on the throne and keep them there. And when they don't like them anymore or they want to do something different, they manipulate them. We now have Prince William, who is slated to be the heir to the British throne. His biological grandfather, Princess Diana's biological father, was Sir Jimmy Goldsmith. And Sir Jimmy Goldsmith is part of the Rothschild network. The Rothschilds and the Goldsmiths came from Germany, from Frankfurt together to take up banking in the 1700s when the Catholic Church, the Pope, rescinded the law, the religious law for Christians to not be involved in usury or banking. So the Jewish bankers had to reorganize themselves, and it was the Rothschilds and the Goldsmiths who came to London to dominate and to take over and run British banking and finance. Now, the Queen or the King of England is a sovereign ruler. Queen Elizabeth owns personally, because she's a sovereign ruler, 12% of the land on this planet. She owns almost all of the uranium deposits. She's a big player. And now we know that her grandson, Prince William, is a goldsmith.
Yeah, sorry. I'm going to cut this here, and could you call me back because your image is frozen?
Okay.
No, you're back now.
Oh, okay. Now I'm back.
Yeah.
So where should I start again?
Jimmy Goldsmith toward the end.
Okay. So we know now that Prince William is a goldsmith. Now, the woman he married, a commoner, Kate Middleton.
Sorry, I'm going to hang up. Could you call me back?
Yes. I'm right, huh?
Hi.
Hi, Alfred.
Okay, so I'll just start.
Okay.
3, 2, 1. So could you tell us more about Jimmy Goldsmith and his progeny?
Yes. Sir Jimmy Goldsmith is part of the international bankers' financial cabal. And the Goldsmiths and the Rothschilds came to England to run British banking in the 1700s. It was at a time when the Pope rescinded a ban that had lasted over 1,000 years, 1,700 years, in the Christian church, that Christians could not be involved in usury or banking. And in the 1700s, the Pope reversed that order, that ban, that religious law, and allowed Christians to go into banking and usury. So the European Jews who ran the finances and banking they go all the way back to the Roman Empire, the Egyptian Empire, the Mesopotamian Empire. These are old bloodlines of money lenders. And Sir Jimmy Goldsmith is one of them. He was one of them, very prominent one. And he actually is the biological father of Princess Diana. Her mother was involved with him in an affair for 22 years. And she looks like him, and she also looks like Jemima Khan, who is Jimmy Goldsmith's daughter by another wife. Through Jimmy Goldsmith, and as the biological father of Princess Diana, Prince William, who is a successor to the British throne, is a goldsmith, although a hidden one, and he married Kate Middleton, whose mother's maiden name was Goldsmith. So now in this baby George, their new baby that was born last summer, the summer of 2013, he is a goldsmith on his mother's side and father's side. But the people of England and the rest of the world believe he is a Windsor. The Windsors are illegal monarchs in England. But the goldsmiths don't care. What they've done is captured the mineral rights and the property that Queen Elizabeth personally owns as the sovereign ruler of England. And they will mine this planet down to sea level in the next 100 years. They will destroy the entire biosphere. There is nothing to stop them except the common people. And I believe we can do that. Each person in his own way will find a way to resist that, to change it, to counter it, counterattack it, whatever. But people need the right information. And I believe that you and I, in the series of interviews that we have done, have provided the kind of information, the big picture that people need to know in order to put the compartmentalized pieces of the puzzle together in a meaningful way. People all know this. They just don't know how to connect the information they've been fed in little pieces. We are providing the big picture, and it's to empower the public, inform the public, and to encourage them to do their own research, to share it with people, to find ways and measures to counteract what is the looming dark ages that are coming down on us with these horrific weapons. And the universities and science have made it possible. That has to be changed. And by the way, the bankers, international financiers, funded the Royal Society of London, which is the basis for Western science that's poisoned all the rest of the world, and they started the universities.
Right, and people can find, we'll put this at the end, but people can find those interviews and articles going back 10 years at ecologynews.com. That's ecologynews.com. Well, we've come to the end of this segment, and I'd like to go back to where we started, which is the aphorism that Marshall McLuhan, the Canadian thinker, came up with. World War III will be a guerrilla information war with no division between military and civilian participation. And our examination and analysis of Flight 370 seems to be a case in point. And my question to you is, how can our listeners and the citizen at large, knowing that that's what we're entering, this guerrilla information war that melds military and civilians, how can they live through this and survive through this and thrive through this type of atmosphere?
Well, the human spirit is mightier than any military, and when people want to do something, they've done amazing things. I mean, when you think that the largest surface area of the planet was explored and settled, the whole Pacific Ocean region, by indigenous people in little sea kayaks, that's an incredible thing. And it was through the power of the human spirit that they did that. There are ways to counteract this. We need to break out of the paradigms, the memes, the disinformation, the false beliefs, and understand that the City of London financiers, they're just wicked gangsters in partnership with the U.S. and other people, have totally fooled us. They have filled us with so much garbage that we think is reality that we're not in touch with reality. We need to begin to do our own research, and it's all on the front page. There are no secrets. You don't need any secrets. You need to interpret the information that's out there from a different framework, and then you see it all. Just lift the curtain and you'll see that tiny little man behind the curtain who's running all of this. This is simply the Wizard of Oz.
Well, thank you, and we certainly want to thank you for taking time out today to be with us, and we look forward to your coming on again in the future as events develop.
Thank you, Alfred.